The porcelain teacup slipped from Madame C.O. Warren's fingers and shattered against the polished marble floor. The sound echoed, sharp, final, cutting through the luxurious silence of the private reception hall. Every conversation died instantly. No one dared to breathe. Across the room, a young woman froze mid-step, her hands still folded neatly in front of her apron. She hadn't meant to brush past the table. She hadn't meant to draw attention. But the damage was done. "Don't move," Madame C.O. said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Power clung to it like perfume. Heavy, suffocating, absolute. The woman swallowed, her pulse roaring in her ears as fragments of porcelain glittered at her feet. She lowered her eyes, waiting for the punishment everyone knew would come. In this house, mistakes were not forgiven. They were remembered. Around them, the elite guests of the C.O. family watched in silence. Some pitied her. Most didn't care. No one intervened. Because this was Madame C.O. Warren, the woman who built an empire beside her late husband, who ruled men twice her size without ever raising her voice. The woman whose approval decided who lived comfortably, and who disappeared quietly. "Look at me," Madame C.O. said. The young woman obeyed. For a moment, something unreadable flickered across the older woman's face. Not anger, not disgust, recognition. And that, more than the shattered porcelain, made the room hold its breath. Her name was Amara Okoye. She had arrived in Seoul only days earlier with nothing but a small suitcase and a promise of honest work. She had not come looking for power, romance, or danger. She came because her mother was ill, because dignity sometimes meant endurance, and because survival left no room for fear. She did not know this household ruled shadows and bloodlines. She did not know that the woman studying her now had crushed generals and kings with a glance. And she certainly did not know that her life had just split in two. "Leave the mess," Madame C.O. said at last. The room stiffened. Then, slowly, impossibly, she added, "Come with me." A murmur rippled through the room. Because Madame C.O. never summoned strangers. And she never protected them. As Amara followed her across the marble floor, unaware of the fate quietly rearranging itself around her, one truth settled heavily in the air. Nothing about this night was accidental. Amara Okoye arrived at the C.O. estate just before dawn, when the world still held its breath between night and morning. The gates opened without a sound, tall iron bars parting like they already knew her. She stepped through with a small suitcase in one hand and her shoulders drawn straight, not from pride but from habit. Life had taught her that looking small invited cruelty. The estate rose ahead of her, vast and immaculate, its pale stone walls glowing faintly beneath the early light. It was beautiful in a way that felt distant, almost cold. Nothing here welcomed warmth. Everything was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors that power lived here and would not bend. A woman in a dark uniform approached, her steps brisk and precise. "You're the new one," she said, not a question. "Follow me." Amara nodded and followed without a word. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and something sharper. Discipline, perhaps. Staff moved silently through long corridors, their eyes lowered, their footsteps measured. No one spoke unless spoken to. It didn't take long for Amara to understand that this house ran on unspoken rules, and breaking one could cost more than employment. As they passed a wide sitting room, hushed voices drifted through an open doorway. Amara slowed instinctively, then stopped when a sudden silence fell. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of attention turning in her direction. A woman stood near the center of the room. Madame C.O. Warren. She was dressed simply, but everything about her commanded space. Her posture was straight, her gaze unyielding. She did not look like someone who needed to raise her voice. Power clung to her naturally like a second skin. For a moment, her eyes settled on Amara. The air shifted. Amara felt it. An invisible pressure, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She lowered her gaze instinctively, hands clasped before her, heart beating steady but loud in her ears. "This is the new heir," the attendant said, her tone careful. Madame Sio studied Amara in silence. Not with cruelty. Not with warmth either. It was the look of someone measuring worth without emotion. "You're late," she said calmly. Amara lifted her eyes just enough to meet her gaze. "No, ma'am. I arrived early." The attendant stiffened. Pause followed, long enough to feel dangerous. Then, unexpectedly, Madame Sio's lips curved. Just slightly. Not a smile. Something else. "Honest," she said. "That's rare." She turned away as if the matter were settled. "She'll do." And just like that, Amara's fate shifted. Word traveled quickly through the household. The new girl had been seen by Madame Sio herself, and not dismissed. Some whispered curiosity. Others muttered warnings. No one could remember the last time the matriarch had taken interest in a servant. Amara felt the eyes on her as she worked. She moved quietly, efficiently, never asking questions. She cleaned, organized, listened. And she noticed things others didn't. The way staff flinched when Madame Sio passed, the tension beneath polished smiles, the quiet fear wrapped in obedience. By midday, she was assigned to serve tea in the inner sitting room. Her hands remained steady as she carried the tray inside. Madame Sio sat by the window, reviewing documents, the morning light outlining her sharp profile. "Set it there," she said without looking up. Amara did as told. "You're not afraid of me," Madame Sio observed. Amara paused. "I respect you." Faint pause followed. Then, most confused the two. She finally looked up. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or curiosity. "You walk like someone who knows hardship," Madame Sio said quietly. "But you don't carry bitterness." Amara chose her words carefully. "Bitterness is heavy. I can't afford to carry it." For the first time, Madame Sio studied her not as staff, but as a woman. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Nigeria." Small nod. "Far?" "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. This one felt different, less dangerous, more thoughtful. "You may go," Madame Sio said at last. Amara bowed and turned to leave, unaware of the eyes following her, weighing her presence, recalculating futures. By the time she reached the corridor, whispers had already begun. The woman who walked in quietly had been noticed. And in a house built on control, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Madame Sio Warren did not watch people the way others did. She observed them the way a general studies a battlefield. Quietly, patiently, already calculating outcomes long before anyone realized a war had begun. From the upper gallery overlooking the inner courtyard, she stood with her hands folded behind her back, her posture unyielding. Below her, servants moved in careful rhythm, each step measured, each breath controlled. Order ruled this place. Fear maintained it. And somewhere among them moved Amara Okoye. She carried a basket of freshly pressed linens, her gait steady, her head slightly bowed, but not submissive. Madame Sio noticed that immediately. Most new staff walked like shadows, desperate not to be seen. Amara walked as if she understood her place yet refused to shrink inside it. Interesting. Madame Sio's eyes followed her as she crossed the courtyard. The morning sun brushed against the young woman's skin, illuminating her calm expression. There was no fear in her movements, no urgency to please, just quiet efficiency. That unsettled something deep inside Madame Sio, something she had buried long ago. "She doesn't look afraid," murmured one of the senior attendants standing nearby. "She should be," another replied. Madame Sio said nothing. Her gaze lingered as Amara paused to help an older staff member who had dropped a tray. She knelt without hesitation, gathering the scattered items, offering a soft word that Madame Sio couldn't hear, but could feel. Compassion. In this house. That was dangerous. Madame Sio turned away sharply. Compassion made people weak. She had learned that lesson long before the world ever bowed to her name. Later that afternoon, Amara was summoned to the East Wing. The message was delivered without explanation, the way all things were in this house. When she arrived, she found Madame Sio seated alone at a low table, a tea set arranged with precise elegance. "Sit," Madame Sio said. Amara obeyed, lowering herself onto the cushion opposite her. "You've worked in many houses?" Madame Sio asked, pouring tea. "Yes, ma'am. And yet you do not behave like someone who has learned to disappear." Amara hesitated. "I was taught to do my work well, not to erase myself." Pause followed. Madame Sio's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "You speak carefully," she said, "but not fearfully." "I've learned fear doesn't protect you," Amara replied softly. "It only makes you smaller." That earned her a long, searching look. Madame Sio studied her as if reading a text written in a language she had once known but forgotten. There was strength in this girl, not loud, not defiant, but rooted. It reminded her of someone she used to be, before power demanded sacrifices she hadn't understood at the time. "Most people who come here want something," Madame Sio said. "Money, protection, favor." Amara met her gaze steadily. "I want to work. And I want to leave with my dignity." A faint crease appeared between Madame Sio's brows. Not anger, recognition. "You are different," she said quietly. The words were not praise. They were a warning. From that day on, Madame Sio watched Amara closely. She noticed how the staff straightened when Amara entered a room. How arguments softened in her presence. How silence followed her like respect, not fear. And slowly something shifted. At dinner that evening, Madame Sio observed her son from the head of the table. His attention drifted more than it should have, toward the doorway, toward the corridor where Amara had passed moments earlier. Did not go unnoticed. The realization settled in Madame Sio's chest like a slow, unwelcome truth. This girl was not just a servant. She was a disturbance. A crack in the structure Madame Sio had spent a lifetime building. Later that night, as the house fell quiet, Madame Sio stood alone by the window of her private study. Outside, the city pulsed with life and danger, ambition and blood. She thought of Amara's steady eyes, her quiet defiance, her unguarded dignity. And for the first time in years, Madame Sio felt something stir beneath her composure. Concern. Because power, she knew, could be challenged. But influence, true influence, was far more dangerous. And the girl downstairs possessed it without even trying. The queen who never smiled finally did. Just barely. And somewhere deep inside, a line was crossed. The morning began with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin, heavy and watchful. Amara felt it the moment she stepped into the west corridor. The air was different here, charged with expectation. The servants moved more slowly, their eyes lowered deeper than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. She adjusted the tray in her hands and continued forward, aware that she was being watched long before she saw who watched her. Madame Sio stood near the tall windows, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the garden below. She did not turn when Amara entered. She did not need to. "Place it there," she said calmly. Amara obeyed, setting the tea on the low table with practiced care. The porcelain made no sound against the wood. She straightened and waited. Silence stretched between them. It was not uncomfortable, only deliberate. Madame Sio allowed it to grow, measuring how the young woman would carry herself without instruction. Many fidgeted. Some rushed to fill the quiet with nervous words. Others shrank beneath it. Amara did none of those things. She stood still, her hands folded, her breathing steady. Her eyes remained lowered, but not in submission, more like patience. "You've been observed," Madame Sio said at last. Amara inclined her head slightly. "Yes, ma'am. And yet you behave as though you have nothing to prove." "I only do my work." "That answer is safe," Madame Sio replied. "Not honest." Amara hesitated. She felt the weight of the moment pressing in. This was not a test she could study for. This was instinct against instinct. "I don't believe worth comes from being seen," she said finally. "Only from what you leave behind when no one is looking." The words hung in the air, fragile and bold all at once. Madame Sio turned slowly to face her. For a moment, Amara saw something pass across the older woman's face. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of memory. Then it was gone, replaced by calm scrutiny. You speak as if you've lived much longer than your years. I've lived enough, Amara replied softly. Madame Co studied her in silence, her gaze sharp, dissecting. This was how she had evaluated rivals, partners, enemies. This was how she had survived. And yet this girl did not flinch. Tell me, Madame Co said, what would you do if someone tried to take from you what you had earned? Amara thought of her mother, of empty cupboards, of promises broken by men who smiled while taking everything. I would protect it, she said, without becoming what I fear. A faint shift passed through Madame Co's eyes. Approval perhaps quickly masked. Good, she said. Most people confuse survival with cruelty. She turned back toward the window, dismissing her. You may go. Amara bowed and left, unaware of the weight her words had carried. The tests came quietly after that. Small things at first. A task reassigned at the last minute. Instructions given twice, slightly differently, to see which she followed. A deliberate lack of guidance. A watchful silence when mistakes could easily be made. Amara navigated them all with careful grace. When given conflicting orders, she chose the path that harmed no one. When blamed for an error she hadn't made, she accepted the correction without defensiveness and fixed it without complaint. When ignored, she worked as though she were seen. And slowly something shifted. Other servants began to seek her out, not for gossip, but for calm, for clarity, for steadiness. Madame Co noticed everything. One evening, as dusk softened the mansion's sharp edges, she watched Amara help an elderly groundskeeper up the steps, taking his tools without being asked. The man bowed gratefully. Amara smiled and returned to her work as if nothing had happened. That was when Madame Co understood. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it moved quietly, building loyalty without force. That night, Madame Co summoned her again. Do you know why people fear me? She asked without preamble. Yes, Amara said. Because you don't need to raise your voice. A corner of Madame Co's mouth twitched. And do you fear me? Amara considered her answer carefully. I respect you. Fear is something else. Madame Co held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Good. It was not praise. It was recognition. And in that moment, something unspoken settled between them. A mutual understanding forged not by obedience, but by strength. As Amara left the room, she felt it again. That subtle shift in the air. Eyes were measuring her now. Not to dismiss her, but to decide what she was worth. The invitation came without ceremony. A folded card placed beside Amara's tray at dawn, its edges sharp, its message brief. Attend the afternoon gathering. Service required. No signature. None was needed. In this house, requests were commands. By midday, the estate had transformed. Long tables were dressed in pale silk. Crystal caught the light like frozen fire. Guests arrived in quiet waves. Politicians, business heirs, women wrapped in elegance and entitlement. Their laughter was light, practiced, edged with judgment. Amara stood at the far end of the room with the other attendants, hands folded, spine straight. She felt the shift immediately. This was not a gathering meant for warmth. It was a stage. And she was meant to be seen. Madame Co entered last. Conversation died the moment her heels touched the marble. She moved with calm authority, every step deliberate. She took her seat at the center of the table, eyes scanning the room once, then stopping briefly on Amara. Just long enough to be noticed. Amara lowered her gaze. The silence broke, conversation rising again, sharper now. Eyes followed her movements as she poured tea, refilled glasses, adjusted linens. She could feel their curiosity pressing in, like fingers testing a bruise. She's new, someone murmured. So young. So composed. Too composed. A woman in ivory leaned toward her companion. Is she staff? Or something else. Amara heard every word. She did not react. When she reached the far end of the table, a voice stopped her. Girl. He turned. A woman with perfectly sculpted features and a smile that didn't reach her eyes gestured toward her cup. This tea is cold. Amara checked it. It wasn't. I'll replace it, ma'am. The woman tilted her head. Careful. In houses like this, mistakes linger. Amara inclined her head. Of course. She took the cup, turned, and the woman's hand moved. The porcelain slipped. It shattered at Amara's feet. Gasps followed. Silence thickened. Tea splashed against the hem of Amara's uniform, warmth seeping into the fabric. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. I'm so clumsy, the woman said lightly. I hope you won't be punished for my mistake. Eyes flicked toward Madame Co. This was the moment. Amara lowered herself slowly, gathering the shards with bare hands. A thin line of red appeared across her palm. She did not hiss, did not rush. She continued, steady, composed, her blood staining the white cloth beneath her. The room held its breath. Stop! Madame Co's voice cut through the space. Amara froze. Stand up. She did. A single drop of blood fell to the floor between them. Madame Co rose from her seat. You are bleeding. Yes, ma'am. Why didn't you call for help? Amara met her eyes. I was told to clean the mess. Silence. The woman in ivory shifted uncomfortably. Madame Co turned slowly toward her. Did you push the cup? The woman laughed nervously. Of course not. It slipped. Madame Co studied her, unblinking. You will apologize. The woman stiffened. Excuse me. To her. The room stilled. That's unnecessary. Madame Co's gaze hardened. Now. Pride wavered. I apologize, the woman said stiffly. Madame Co turned back to Amara. Go. Have your hand treated. Amara bowed. As she turned to leave, she felt something shift, an invisible current changing direction. Later, in the quiet of the service corridor, an attendant wrapped her hand in clean linen. Amara stared at the wall, her heart still steady, her breath even. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She hadn't broken. That evening, from the upper balcony, Madame Co watched her cross the courtyard, her posture unchanged despite the pain. Strength like that could not be taught, only revealed. And as the doors closed behind Amara, Madame Co allowed herself one thought she had not permitted in years. This girl would not bend. And that made her dangerous. The shift began quietly. Too quietly. Amara noticed it first in the way conversations paused when she entered a room. In the way eyes flicked toward her and then away, as if acknowledging something unspoken. The warmth she had earned from the staff thinned, replaced by caution. Even kindness, she realized, could become dangerous when it drew attention. By the third morning after the incident in the hall, her duties had changed. She was sent to the far wing of the estate, areas rarely used, rooms that smelled faintly of dust and sealed windows. Work meant for two people was now assigned to one. Tasks overlapped. Instructions contradicted each other. Mistakes became inevitable, and every mistake was recorded. It was deliberate. She felt it in the air. When she arrived late to the kitchens, only minutes delayed by a locked door, Mrs. Han did not scold her. She smiled. Careful, she said lightly. Some people don't forgive delays. Amara nodded and went to work, aware that someone was always watching now. That afternoon, a tray was left just inside a doorway, placed where it would be impossible not to knock over. When it crashed, the sound echoed loudly through the corridor. The reprimand came swiftly, sharp enough to sting. She accepted it without defense. At dinner, her name was whispered between sips of wine. She's becoming bold. She forgets her place. Madame Co protects her too much. The words were soft, but their intent was sharp. Amara felt the shift inside herself. Not fear but alertness. She understood now. The danger was no longer in what she did wrong, but in what she represented. A reminder that power could be challenged, that silence could be strength. That evening, she was summoned to the side hall. Madame Sio was not there. Instead, 3 women sat near the low table, their postures relaxed, their eyes calculating. One of them, dressed in muted silk, gestured for Amara to kneel. "Sit," she said. Amara hesitated, then lowered herself onto the cushion across from them. "You've become quite visible," the woman said lightly. "That's unusual for someone in your position." "I do my work," Amara replied. Soft laugh. "You do more than that. You draw attention." Another woman leaned forward. "You should be careful. Attention invites misunderstanding." "I've done nothing wrong." "No," the first woman agreed. "But you're standing where you don't belong." The words settled like dust in the air. Amara met her gaze. "With respect, I go where I'm told." The woman smiled thinly. "Not anymore." A pause followed, heavy and deliberate. "You should ask to be transferred," she continued, "to the lower quarters. Or leave altogether. It would be safer." Amara's heartbeat steadied. "I can't." The woman's smile faded. "Then you're choosing difficulty." "I'm choosing honesty." Silence. One of the women stood. "Then don't say you weren't warned." They dismissed her without ceremony. That night, Amara walked back to her room alone. The corridors felt longer, darker. She sensed eyes in every shadow. When she reached her door, she found it slightly ajar. Her breath caught. Inside, her belongings were scattered across the floor. Her suitcase lay open, clothes tossed aside. Nothing was taken. Nothing broken. A message without words. She knelt and began to gather her things, hands steady despite the chill creeping through her chest. This was not theft. It was a threat. When she finished, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. For the first time since arriving, doubt whispered at the edges of her resolve. Was dignity worth this? A knock sounded. She opened the door to find Madame Sio standing there. No entourage. No attendants. Just her. "You should have come to me," Madame Sio said quietly. "I didn't want to seem weak." "Strength is not silence," Madame Sio replied. Her gaze moved past Amara, taking in the disarray, the message left behind. "So," she said softly, "they've begun." Amara looked up. "I don't want trouble." Madame Sio studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Trouble does not ask permission." She turned to leave, then stopped. "You are not alone in this house," she said without looking back. "Remember that." When the door closed, Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something had shifted again. The pressure was no longer subtle. The game had begun. And standing tall now came with a price. The summons came just before dawn. Not through the usual channels. Not through a servant or a folded note. This time it came with footsteps outside Amara's door. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. When she opened it, Madame Sio stood there alone. The corridor lights caught the silver in her hair, the calm severity of her face. She did not look angry. That somehow was worse. "Come with me," she said. Amara followed without a word. They walked in silence through halls that seemed to hold their breath as they passed. The estate was still asleep, but something beneath the quiet felt restless, as though the house itself sensed a shift in its balance. They stopped before a private sitting room rarely used. Madame Sio opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, 3 women waited. The same ones who had summoned Amara the day before. Their expressions changed the moment they saw Madame Sio. Smiles tightened. Spines straightened. One of them stood too quickly, nearly knocking over her tea. "Madame Sio," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. "We weren't expecting." "I know," Madame Sio replied calmly, closing the door behind her. She took her seat at the head of the room, motioning for Amara to stand beside her. The air thickened. "I was informed," Madame Sio continued, "that certain members of my household have taken it upon themselves to discipline my staff." No one spoke. You questioned her, she went on. Threatened her. Entered her quarters without permission. I want to know why. The woman nearest her cleared her throat. We were only trying to maintain order. She's disruptive. Disruptive how? She draws attention. People talk. Madame Co nodded slowly. People always talk. Another woman spoke, emboldened. With respect, madam, you've allowed her too much visibility. It sends the wrong message. And what message is that? Madame Co asked. That anyone can rise, she said carefully. That boundaries no longer matter. Madame Co leaned back, studying her. And that frightens you. The woman stiffened. Silence stretched. It was not comfortable. Madame Co turned her gaze to Amara. Tell me what happened. Amara hesitated. Every instinct told her to soften the truth, to protect herself by making herself smaller. But something in Madame Co's eyes told her that would be a mistake. They warned me to leave, Amara said calmly. They said I didn't belong. And they went through my things. The room went still. Madame Co's jaw tightened. Without permission. Yes. A long moment passed. Then Madame Co stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You have forgotten where authority comes from, she said quietly. It does not come from blood alone. Comes from discipline. From loyalty. From restraint. She turned to the women. You embarrassed this house. Their faces paled. You mistook my silence for approval, she continued. And you mistook her dignity for weakness. She gestured toward Amara. Let me be clear. She is under my protection. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. If anyone so much as inconveniences her again, Madame Co said, her voice calm and deadly, you will answer to me. The message landed heavy and final. The women bowed deeply, murmuring apologies. Fear now etched into their expressions. Madame Co dismissed them with a flick of her hand. When the door closed, the silence that followed felt different. Cleaner. Amara stood still, her heart pounding. I didn't ask for this, she said quietly. I know, Madame Co replied. She turned to her, studying her with a gaze that no longer tested, but measured something else entirely. You remind me of someone I once was, she said. Before I learned that mercy has a cost. I don't want to cause trouble. You already have, Madame Co said softly. And that is not always a bad thing. Pause. Blood does not always choose blood, she added. Sometimes, character does. Amara swallowed. What happens now? Madame Co looked at her for a long moment. Now, she said, you stop pretending you're small. She moved toward the door then stopped. You will dine with me tonight. It was not a request. As the door closed behind her, Amara stood alone in the quiet room, heart racing, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Expectation. For the first time since she arrived, she understood the truth. The lines had been drawn. And Madame Co had chosen a side. The dining hall had never felt so still. Candles burned low along the long table, their flames steady despite the quiet tension thickening the air. Guests sat in polished rows, executives, patrons, allies, each one carefully composed, each one trained to read power in the smallest movements. At the head of the table, Madame Co sat in her usual place, composed and unreadable. Amara stood several steps behind her, hands folded, posture calm. She could feel every gaze brushing against her skin, curious, calculating. The whispering had not stopped since the announcement that she would be present this evening. Not serving, not assisting, but standing beside the matriarch herself. That alone was a disruption. Dinner progressed in clipped conversations and half-smiles. Crystal chimed softly. Chopsticks touched porcelain. But beneath the elegance ran a current of anticipation. An unspoken sense that something was about to shift. Madame Co had not spoken much. When she did, it was brief and deliberate, enough to command attention without inviting familiarity. Then, midway through the meal, she set down her glass. The sound was small, carried anyway. Before we continue, she said calmly, there is a matter I wish to address. Every movement stilled. She rose slowly, her presence commanding the room as it always had. But tonight there was something different in her posture. Less armor, more intention. She turned slightly and extended a hand. Amara. The name fell into the silence like a stone into water. Amara hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. Her pulse beat steadily, though she could feel the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her back. Madame Sio looked at her, not with scrutiny, not with test, but with something quieter, purposeful. This house has long been built on bloodlines, she said. On inheritance. On obedience dressed as loyalty. A ripple of unease passed through the room. But blood alone does not define strength, she continued. Nor does birth grant character. Her gaze swept the table, sharp and unwavering. Character reveals itself in restraint, in courage, in dignity when no one is watching. She turned back to Amara. This woman arrived here with nothing but her integrity. And she has not bent. Not when pressured. Not when threatened. Not when it would have been easier to disappear. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. She has shown me what loyalty looks like when it is chosen, not inherited. Then calmly, clearly, Madame Sio spoke the words that fractured the room. From this moment on, she stands under my name. A sharp intake of breath rippled across the table. My future daughter-in-law. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Someone dropped their chopsticks. Someone else laughed nervously, thinking it a joke. But Madame Sio did not smile. Amara's breath caught. Her heart thundered in her chest as she turned, disbelief flooding her features. She had expected protection. Perhaps even favor. Not this. Madame Sio faced her then, eyes steady. You do not need to answer now, she said quietly. This is not a cage. It is a declaration. She turned back to the room. Those who respect my house will respect her. Those who challenge her, challenge me. Silence swallowed the hall. No one argued. No one dared. The message had landed with finality. When the meal resumed, it did so under a different order. Conversations were careful now. Eyes followed Amara with new calculation. Fear, curiosity, resentment. Each took its turn. Amara sat where she was directed, her hands folded, her breath measured. Inside, her world had tilted. She felt exposed, elevated, and strangely grounded all at once. Madame Sio leaned slightly toward her. You're trembling, she said softly. Only a little, Amara admitted. Good, Madame Sio replied. It means you understand the weight of what was given. He paused. And you did not refuse. Amara met her gaze. You didn't ask. A faint smile touched Madame Sio's lips. Exactly. The dinner continued, but nothing about the night could be undone. By the time the guests departed, the lines had been redrawn. The staff whispered her name with caution now. The house breathed differently around her. And as Amara walked back through the halls that once felt foreign, she understood something with startling clarity. She had not been claimed. She had been chosen. And the world beyond those walls would soon feel the consequence. The protection came swiftly. Too swiftly. By morning, the house had changed its rhythm around Amara. Doors opened before she reached them. Voices softened when she passed. Guards, once distant figures she barely noticed, now shifted subtly into her line of sight wherever she went. It was not kindness. It was containment. She felt it in the way the air tightened around her steps. At breakfast, her usual place near the service corridor was empty. Instead, a chair waited closer to the main table, not beside Madame Sio, but close enough to be seen. Close enough to be counted. Amara hesitated. Sit, Madame Sio said calmly. The word carried weight. So did the silence that followed when Amara obeyed. Across the table, eyes measured her openly now. Not with cruelty, not always, but with calculation. As if trying to understand the shape of her new shadow. Protection, she realized, was not a shield. It was a spotlight. Later that day, 2 guards were assigned to her corridor. They did not speak unless spoken to. Their presence followed her like a second skin, unwanted, inescapable. "I don't need this," she told Madame Sio that evening when they were alone. "You do," came the answer, firm but not unkind. "I didn't ask for it." Madame Sio's gaze softened, just a fraction. Power is rarely asked for. It's given. And once given, it does not leave without a cost. Amara folded her hands. "People are afraid of me now." "They should be careful," Madame Sio corrected. "There's a difference." That night, Amara couldn't sleep. The walls felt closer. The silence louder. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of the life she'd lived before. Quiet, honest, unseen. She had wanted safety, not influence. Stability, not attention. Now every step she took was watched. The next morning brought proof. A senior staff member, one who had once laughed freely in her presence, avoided her eyes while pouring tea. Another bowed too deeply, too formally, her voice tight with unease. "Please," Amara said gently. "You don't have to." "I do," the woman whispered. "I'm sorry." The distance hurt more than hostility. Later in the garden, she found Madame Sio watching the koi pond. Sunlight glinted off the water, scattering gold across the stones. "They're afraid of you," Amara said. Madame Sio did not look up. "They're afraid of what you represent." "I don't want this kind of power." Madame Sio turned then, studying her closely. "Power does not ask what you want. It asks who you are." Amara swallowed. "And what am I?" For a moment Madame Sio said nothing. "Someone who reminds people of themselves," she said at last. "And that is the most dangerous mirror of all." That afternoon, the true cost revealed itself. A young attendant, barely more than a girl, was dismissed abruptly. No explanation. No farewell. Whispers followed that she had spoken carelessly, questioned the change in hierarchy. The blame, though unspoken, hung in the air. Amara felt it settle on her shoulders like a cloak she had never asked to wear. She found Madame Sio in the study, standing before a shelf of old photographs. "This is my fault," Amara said quietly. Madame Sio didn't turn. "No. It is the price of fear. But she's gone because of me." "Because she forgot her place," Madame Sio replied. Then after a pause, softer. "And because I allowed it." Amara stepped closer. "Then stop it." Madame Sio turned slowly. "You think power can be clean. I think it can be kinder." A long silence passed. When Madame Sio spoke again, her voice carried something raw. "Kindness is a luxury I learned to bury." "Maybe that's why it frightens you," Amara said gently. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then Madame Sio exhaled. "You are changing things," she admitted. "Whether you want to or not." Amara met her gaze, steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest. "Then teach me how to carry it without breaking others." Madame Sio studied her for a long moment. "Very well," she said finally. "But understand this. Once you carry power, you will be blamed for everything it touches." Amara nodded. She already felt the weight. And yet, as she left the room, she knew something else too. She was no longer standing alone. And whatever this power would cost her, she would pay it standing upright. The house did not sleep that night. It listened. Walls carried whispers. Footsteps echoed with memory. Every corridor seemed to breathe differently, as if aware that something irreversible had already taken root. Amara stood at the tall window of her room, watching the garden below glow faintly under lantern light. The night air pressed cool against the glass, steadying her thoughts. She no longer felt like a guest here, nor entirely like a servant. The space between those identities had narrowed, dangerously so. A soft knock came at the door. They turned. Madame Sio entered without waiting for permission. There was no formality in her posture now, no armor. She wore a simple robe, her hair loosely pinned. her expression unreadable but unguarded in a way Amara had never seen before. "You should be resting," Madame Co said. "So should you," Amara replied gently. A flicker of something, approval perhaps, passed between them. Madame Co moved closer, stopping beside the window. Together, they looked out at the estate that had shaped and scarred so many lives. "You understand what happened today," Madame Co said. "I understand that people are afraid," Amara answered. "And that fear makes them cruel." Madame Co nodded. "And it also makes them loyal." Silence settled between them, thick but not uncomfortable. "When I was young," Madame Co said slowly, "I believed power was something you seized, something you fought for until your hands bled. I learned too late that power without purpose devours itself." She turned to Amara. "You carry purpose without trying. That is why they respond to you." Amara swallowed. "I never wanted this kind of attention. No one who deserves it ever does." A long pause followed. "I lost my daughter many years ago," Madame Co said suddenly. The words hung heavy in the air. "She was younger than you, strong in her own way. She questioned me often, challenged my decisions." Her voice softened. "I mistook that for defiance." Amara's breath caught. "She died believing I didn't see her." The confession settled between them, raw and unguarded. "I will not make that mistake again," Madame Co said quietly. Amara felt something in her chest tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Madame Co shook her head. "No, this is not sorrow. This is truth." She reached out then, slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over Amara's. The touch was steady, certain. "You were not sent here by accident," she said. "You were sent to remind me who I once was." Amara met her gaze, eyes shining but unafraid. "I don't want to replace anyone." "You won't," Madame Co said. "You will stand beside me." Beat passed. "Not as property," she added. "Not as obligation." She took a breath. "But as family." The word settled into the space like a promise. Amara's throat tightened. She had crossed oceans to survive. She had never imagined belonging could feel this heavy, and this right. "I don't know how to be that," she admitted. Madame Co's lips curved faintly. "Neither did I once." Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Somewhere distant, the city pulsed with life and consequence. From that night forward, the house shifted. The staff no longer whispered her name in fear, but in reverence. Doors opened not because they were ordered to, but because people chose to step aside. Madame Co began to consult her, not in command but in conversation. Decisions were weighed, voices heard. A legacy was forming, not of blood or dominance, but of choice. And when Amara walked the halls now, she did not shrink. She carried herself with quiet certainty, aware that she was no longer standing in borrowed space. She had been claimed, yes, but more importantly, she had been chosen. And in that choice, a new future had begun.